I'd love to bring it. You mentioned obviously data and video monitoring. Could you talk a little bit about that relationship? What access do insurance companies have to that kind of data collected in AVs?
Yeah, so as a start, I think it would be good for the people in the audience to recognize that we're actually talking about two different uh, types of vehicles. So people use the term autonomous a little too loosely. So right now we are experiencing a lot more growth in assisted driving, or what's called ADAS related features in cars, as opposed to autonomous or self-driving, which is the human beings not driving. There's a lot more technology out there that is already being used that really impacts liability and insurance scenarios through ADAS operations. So, for instance, the minute I'll just use one company by name, but not to pick on them. The minute a Tesla has an accident, provided it's in the right cell zone, meaning there's cell coverage, data is transferred, and the accident has to be significant enough, but the data is transferred almost immediately from the accident, from the car to a cloud, and that includes the video and the data associated with the event. Not just 5 seconds. We're not talking about what's called black box data, or more technically speaking, what's called EDR data. EDR data is very limited. It's 5 seconds long and only captures about 20, 30 signals. By contrast, this automotive data that I'm referring to is recorded at thousands of a second, and it's recording things that human beings would not know, like what was the car thinking, what systems were in place, why was the car reacting the way it was. And the insurance industry is very quickly starting to figure out that the data and the video about those events are incredibly important. But even more significantly now, customers are able to access their own data under the data privacy laws, and they can request that data, and they get it in about an hour or so. So picture the customer showing up to the claim reporting stage and already has video and data belonging to this accident. And a lot of them will say, not my fault, and have either a convenient memory or they really don't understand what happened. And sometimes we can see in the data on thousands of a second basis when the car did something wrong, or when the consumer says, I was doing this and they really weren't. And what we do is we marry the video and the data together to create this accurate representation of what took place. And it's really changing the dynamics of what happens in the claims process. And as we further evolve down this pathway, where a lot of the fights or we'll call risk transfer, but they're really fights between insurance companies and sometimes the plaintiff bar, is things like driver versus driver. Who ran the stop sign? Who had the red light? Who made the move left of center? Those things are all right now a verbal account that's reported to the police. The police write it down. Very rarely do they get it right. And a lot of times it's all based on subjective evidence. So this is going to eliminate the need for police to write those narratives. It's going to eliminate the need to interview these people to a large degree. It is going to cut down on fraud, and it will eliminate a lot of questionable liability claims that insurance companies find themselves in, where they feel like they have to pay a claim just to avoid litigation. So again, when I said it's data, and it's really important to understand that this data is out there now, even in plain old cars. If your car has a camera behind the windshield and right behind usually the rear view mirror, it's recording data. And those cameras, many cars now, somewhere between 8 and 14 cameras, are recording data. So you can take that data and address all the problems that Russ talked about, and it also can protect those people that make these components and promote safety from the standpoint of what was working, what wasn't. And I'll just end with this one point. The question, and I see it's later on in some of the questions you're going to ask, are these vehicles safe enough? the best way to determine whether or not a car is safe is to look at when the technology doesn't work. And in the automotive industry, in the engineering circles, that's called an edge case. Well, the ultimate edge case is when a car has an accident, not when the car might have thought something went wrong, but something actually did go wrong. So I'll stop there. But the best use case to determine safety and interplay between technologies is to look at the data that's going through the vehicles on a nanosecond basis.
Very, very interesting. Yeah, thanks, Mike. In most of this, obviously, it's been kind of talking about how the U.S. has been looking at this issue. So, Rebecca, would love to bring you in on this. Last fall, King Charles announced his proposal for an AV bill to establish a new legal framework for AVs in the UK. Curious what you can tell us about that proposal and specifically how it looks at this issue of liability.
Of course. Yes. So the AV bill announced in 2023 was a huge milestone for the UK autonomous vehicle ecosystem, really making it quite apparent how far this sector has come and how rapidly it's evolving. Certainly, we've seen a really high level of engagement by the insurance sector post that announcement. What that AV bill is looking to ultimately work towards is some kind of defined liability across different parties. We expect to see that probably in 2025 to 2026 in the UK. It's very clear that the passenger in the vehicle, because they would be a passenger in an autonomous vehicle, and I want to make clear I'm not speaking about ADAS here, just for pure transparencies, and also not to get into that very grey area, as Mike quite correctly pointed out. That's highly nuanced. When we're talking about a fully autonomous vehicle requiring no manual interaction, it's very clear that the passenger will not be liable for an incident. The next step is starting to map out which respective party might be, to whom liability is assigned. Today, looking at AV deployments, really from a liability perspective, they're customized in terms of the risk relationship between the parties, and the risk attribution tends to be defined on a contract by contract basis. That is international. That is not a UK only feature. That's very much how these things are playing out at the moment. It is a commercial negotiation. In the case of a commercial AV microtransit system, for example, the parties that typically have to agree on risk share will tend to be the self-driving software supplier, the vehicle manufacturer, a service operator, and probably also a service owner. A lot of the time in the US, of course, that's a public body. It will be the same in the UK as well. There is a distinction between the legal responsibility to a safety regulator and how that contractual risk is apportioned at the moment, because we are in somewhat of a vacuum when it comes to formal crystallization of liability. So that is somewhat case by case. It's obviously very complex, so it's something that does need to be crystallized as soon as possible. That's the liability. Just to be clear, probably for today's conversation as well, it's worth mentioning there is a difference between insurance solutions and ultimate legal liability, because that doesn't get too wedded to subrogation where that's relevant. If you're talking purely about an insurance solution, that is a different conversation about what the future fit for purpose insurance solution looks like. And agreed with Mike's comment around the ambiguity around insurer responsibility is something that we want to avoid as a sector in the autonomous vehicle ecosystem. We do not want to be creating an environment where the insurance space is not comfortable. We want to make that as clear as possible. Data will help enormously with that. These vehicles have a 360-degree field of vision, depth of vision over 3 American football pitches. They have LiDAR, they have radar, they are able to see and perceive much better than a human driver. Data is rich. It's a naturally data-rich environment. there actually should be no dispute over what happened. I think that's agree entirely with Mike. There will not be lengthy conversations if people are willing to share data. There won't be lengthy conversations about what happened. That will be immediately obvious from the moment the incident happens. Then it comes down to whether the insurance pays out, of course, absolutely critical that it does. What does that insurance solution look like? It's probably not the traditional model. We need to be looking at a systems thinking approach to this solution, looking at a holistic approach to risk, a single insurer ensuring an autonomous vehicle deployment irrespective of the cause of the loss, for example. And then, of course, you have the absolute legal liability, which sits behind the insurance solution. So that's how we're looking at it as OXO. We're not alone in that. It's acknowledged to be the forward-looking approach to insurance, obviously acknowledging that the liability needs to be established as well. And these are conversations that are very much live, very much ongoing, huge level of engagement from the insurance space internationally. So that's where we stand, and that's our perspective.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Really interesting perspectives. I just want to very quickly plug that PAVE UK is launching next Wednesday, February 21st in London. So we were really grateful for the incredible forward-thinking approaches of the UK. What do we know about safety or the potential risks of cars with ADAS technology versus human drivers not using assistance technologies? Do you have any?
I have some thoughts on that, Tara, if you want. So a nice organization to pay attention to is the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. And they study things like how effective certain technologies are. And when we get into these higher end technologies, there's a lot of stuff that is pretty easy to understand. Backup cameras and backup warning systems. So IIHS says that's a clear winner. The data shows that this has dramatically decreased the number of accidents and the severity in those accidents. They're just beginning to pay attention to things like lane keeping assist and traffic aware cruise control, or what some people will call autopilot. Another organization that's really on top of this stuff is MIT, and you've had Brian Reamer speak, and this is the other end of the spectrum. The more you use these technologies to drive down the road while you're in, I'll call it autopilot, because that's a term people understand, the longer you rely upon that, the more likely it is that you're not going to pay attention. You lull yourself into a false sense of security. And I'll add the last part. There's this really important dynamic to this whole discussion of human factors. So the manufacturers put in all the literature, and it's in some of these laws, including the UK law that's been talked about, that human beings are responsible to oversee the vehicle. It takes about 2 seconds for a person who's involved in any kind of an accident to start to size up the issue of, oh my God, I'm having a problem. This is a different event than I expected. And then to formulate a plan, that's even more time, and then to execute on that plan. So in many of these accidents, while the manufacturers, and I would say conveniently, say, this is not our problem, it's yours, you're responsible, they miss the point, intentionally or not, that human beings cannot do what's called a takeover response. They just can't. And if you add to that, that they're lulled into a false sense of security, more so. So we're going to, as we start to deal with legal liability, we're going to have to start to deal with the fact that human beings are not good safety drivers. And that's been borne out by a lot of good science. And so I'll end my point on that.
Really interesting. Rebecca, this is a question that came in from the audience, actually from the UK, so I wanted to address it to you. It asks, how far should information sharing be mandated through regulation between AV developers and insurers?
Yeah, it's a great question, and something that we're working on and will be part of the lobbying that our ecosystem will be doing with the regulator over the coming 12 months or so. That there is actually quite a significant appetite from people within the space that there is some kind of standardized level of minimum required data sharing, that there is not the starting point is that it is not the desire of the ecosystem to share as little as possible. I think it's probably important to note that the transparency is something that we all want very much for the benefit of everyone. The standardization and minimum requirements will be part of that conversation because, of course, it needs to be part of the conversation around building out a fit for purpose liability matrix. And starting to create future-proof regulations so that things like insurance can be built around that framework. So to date, there is nothing in terms of a standardization of minimum data sharing requirements. We certainly are working towards that being something that is implemented in due course. It's not a very straightforward answer because obviously there's a lot of conversation around how long data needs to be kept, what level of data needs to be kept from a pure kind of data storage perspective. The depth of data collected on these vehicles every second, it far exceeds anything that would be useful or usable in the event of wanting to build defensibility or in order to kind of promote transparency. There is far more data than is required. So defining what is actually necessary and usable is part of that process, which is why it's the conversations have some time. Really, they need to run their course a little bit further. It's not. We have more data than is usable as an ecosystem. So it's defining what is useful and then what everyone needs to be mandated to share.
That's really interesting. Mike, one final question. I love part of what we love to do at PAVE is, like we said, bring in the public sector and private sector and kind of help to convene those conversations. From your perspective in the private industry, like what do you see would be helpful in bringing all these parties together? What communication? We've talked about data sharing. What do you think can help to push this conversation forward?
Yeah, I think we need an organization, and maybe it's an already established organization, but an organization where it brings in all the different stakeholders, enlightened by what Rebecca's brought to the conversation. There are some automakers that are like, you're not getting my data, and if you do, you have to pay for it. So that may be dated. But I think we need all stakeholders, police officers, some at the federal level, the NTSB, and say, okay, how do we look at legal liability? How do we look at insurance? But how do we look at standards? What are the standards for that data? And it has to be global. So for instance, there's been a lot of work in the last few years by the Society of Automotive Engineers on improving what's called the black box. Again, it's a small device. It doesn't capture nearly the data that I've been talking about. It's 5 seconds of data. In the European Union, the United Nations is involved. China's involved. They're advocating for 30 seconds of data. So just the time frame for how long data is captured in a more or less obsolete device is a battleground. So I think we need to bring in stakeholders from all these constituents. In the United States, automobiles are regulated by federal regulators, and insurance companies are regulated at the state level. We haven't talked about the police. We haven't talked about the plaintiff bar and the judges. So we need to bring these stakeholders in and start to talk about how to develop standards, because without that, we're not going to be able to develop public policy behind these concepts. So I think that's a really important part, to start forming an organization or several organizations where real hard work gets done. I'll point out that the new UK law came about by a 4-year study of the UK Law Commission. Think about how much work went into that. And that law, or it's not law, it's just a bill right now. It's going to take another year of vetting in the UK. So there's a lot of work to be done. And as I said in another forum about a month ago, we keep talking about how important that is, but we better start working on it now. And it's going to hold back the advancement of safe technology if we don't get this part of it right.
For sure. That is such a good point, Mike. And it's interesting to think both that, this takes a long time to do, but then also, in that 4 years, how much changes. So it's like things are changing in real time as you're doing this work and these studies.